Hey guys, Zach here, GM from the Mortals and Portals podcast, and today I want to do a quick rundown on my process for homebrew world design. This isn't an exhaustive step-by-step guide on how to do this. We as GMs all have our own creative and interesting way of doing things. I'm not trying to change that for you. I just want to give you a few things that I like to think about when I'm diving into creating a setting for a long-running homebrew campaign. So let's dive into it. Okay, the first thing I like to start with is scope. If you think about it, as GMs, we have two very finite resources, and that is time and energy. Just because you got the time to work on something doesn't mean you have the energy, and vice versa. So for me, it helps to know the scope of the world I'm starting with. For example, if I want to do a Harry Potter style campaign that takes place in Hogwarts or whatever castle you come up with, then that means I probably have enough time to work on specific rooms, classrooms, dungeons, the forests surrounding it. I can spend a lot of time putting a lot of particular detail into something because I really only have to worry about this small region or even this single castle. On the flip side, if I'm doing a Star Wars style campaign that takes place in an entire galaxy, I have to develop planets and be a little less precise, a little less detailed. If you think about it, in Star Wars, all of the planets really boil down to one biome. It's like a swamp, or it's a desert, or it's covered in ice, and that's about it. And that's because it's an entire galaxy. It's larger in scope. You don't have time to worry about these really nitty-gritty details. So determining the scope of what I'm working on helps me prioritize how much time I should be spending on certain things, which helps me avoid getting burnt out or frustrated or wasting a bunch of time. So lock in your scope. You can always expand it or retract it later, but it's really going to help you set yourself up for success if you know just how grand of a world you're building. The next thing I like to think about is themes or mechanics, and these are aspects that are going to resonate throughout your world. They're going to be consistent. They're going to drive the narrative, conflict. It's going to make everything in the world feel familiar and tied together. So this is very, very important. Themes can be as simple and as complex as you want them. If you look at classic stories like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, it's very much about good versus evil. There's very clear bad guys, very clear good guys. There's not a lot of moral gray area. These bad guys either want to blow up planets or conquer the entire world and shrouded in evil, so you gotta stop them. But that is still a consistent theme that rings throughout the adventure. Themes can also be a little more nuanced. Like if you look at the Witcher series, it's very much about lesser evils and who the good guys are, who is the true monster. It's hard to tell. Geralt is constantly making choices between, well, this is still bad, but it's good in this way, and same with this choice, so which one do I do? And that theme also rings consistent throughout the story. Mechanics, on the other hand, don't necessarily need to be tied to a theme, although they can aid them or amplify them, but there's something that's unique about the setting that makes it distinct from other ones and can drive a lot of the narrative and conflict. A very clear example of this would be Dune. In the setting of Dune, they have something called spice, and spice is essential to space travel and also grants other benefits to those who use it, such as expanding their mind and things like that. But spice can only be found on one planet, so a lot of the conflict is driven around this planet because it has the most valuable resource in the known galaxy. And another example of this would be Mortals and Portals, how we have nodes, so travel between the 7 planets is through these ancient and mysterious landmarks called nodes, and every planet has them, and when a planet goes about its orbit and rotates and aligns with another node, it briefly creates a link between those planets and allows you to transport between them. So although there is space travel, it's limited, and control of these nodes is highly sought after, and that is a consistent theme and mechanic in the story, drives a lot of the conflict. Now, before we move on to the other ones, this is a great place to stop. If you're at this stage in your conceptual world design, I would urge you to meet with your prospective players and share this idea with them. Simply go over your scope, saying I want to build a world that's roughly this big, and these are the sorts of themes and mechanics I want to implement in it. Does this sound interesting to you? For instance, if you're trying to come up with some dystopian future nuclear fallout story and you want it to take place in one single region and that's your idea, and you share that with your players and they say, that's not really interesting to me, or oh, I was just in a campaign like that, I'm looking for something more lighthearted, then you may save yourself a lot of heartache developing a world and all the lore and everything that goes into it, only to have your players not want to engage with it. Alternatively, they might be very excited and start to give you more ideas and ask questions that spark other lines of thought for you and can really help with your world design. But either way, you should always stop, check with them, make sure everyone is on the same page before you invest more time and energy into this. Okay, the next one is locations. Now, I'm not talking about getting very specific and fleshing everything out. I just mean look at the scope of your world and the themes and the mechanics you have, and think of things you've always thought would be fun to play in. For instance, if you think Atlantis is cool and you want something like that in your world, find a spot to throw it in. If you love Lord of the Rings and love the Mines of Moria concept and you want to add a mountain range and put some dwarven mines in there, go for it. Or if it fits your world and you want to put a floating city in the sky powered by some crazy technology, do that as well. The key is to put things in your world that sound fun and exciting to you and your players, and as long as it fits your scope, theme, and mechanics, you can worry about the lore, the NPCs that populate it, the backstory to it, and all that later. Because ultimately, all of these things serve as tools in your toolbox that you can use later to craft adventures, cool lore, and just add to the overall narrative and feel of your world. You don't need to figure out all the locations right now. And in fact, I think it's good to leave space for developing characters down the line, which we'll move on to next. This would be the point that I'd like to meet with my potential players and ask what kind of ideas they've had for their characters. You've already met with them and shared your scope and vision and themes and mechanics, and they've probably got some ideas going, so they're gonna give those to you now. At this point, a player may say something like, well, I'm really into anime and I've always wanted a nomadic warrior tribe that's all about power and kind of draws from Naruto and Dragon Ball Z, and at this point you can look at the locations you've had ideas for and see if it fits with any of them. And remember how I said you didn't need to flesh out every detail of this location? Well, that's because the player might have some ideas for their character's homeland that you can implement. And now suddenly you guys are working on this together and it's a very fun and collaborative experience. You can invite them into the world building process, which will help them roleplay their character later on because they'll more deeply know and care about the lore because they helped build it. Alternatively, maybe the player doesn't have any ideas for their character and you can look at the locations you've come up with, things you want to spend more time on, and pitch those ideas to them. You could say things like, well, I have this civilization over here that's very ruthless and has like gladiator combat. Would you be interested in playing a gladiator type character that's trying to earn their freedom or something like that? And they may say, yeah, or it'll spark another idea and it can kind of go on later down the process. Either way, you're at a very great point in your world building process where things can still be molded, changed, and shifted. So I would invite players in at this stage and you can sort of start to flesh things out together. And from here, you can start to craft lore, because remember how I said about adding tools to your toolbox? Well, now you got your players' ideas, you got your themes and mechanics, scope, and some locations you've thrown out there, and now you can start to figure out how they became the way they were, why things are the way they were, what's going on right now, and that ties all these things together. For instance, hearkening back to the anime character, the nomad that I was talking about, which I am talking about Ryu if you listen to the Mortals and Portals podcast, when they wanted this enemy that was pursuing them, I had to stop and think, well, who is this enemy? Why are they pursuing them? What is the history of their conflict? How long has this war been going on? And as you start to answer those questions, you are building out lore, and that's all just to justify the ideas of the player's character. And now that I have some lore and characters and locations and some mechanics, I can start to focus on the story. And this is where I just like to evaluate everything I've created so far. Try and figure out ways that it can all tie together and what interesting things can happen given what I'm working with. Your characters and their backstory likely came up with some things that can help you. Maybe they have a mortal enemy they're seeking vengeance on. Maybe they're fleeing something. Maybe they're in search of something. And you can start to look at that and find ways to tie that into the greater narrative. Maybe the character that's on a quest for vengeance, you can use their enemy as the enemy of the first arc and draw them into the story. The character who's looking for something, maybe this enemy also has that. And this story doesn't have to be completely fleshed out. You do not have to come up with an idea for a 3-year campaign right off the spot. Just start small, start with what you have. I usually like to have a vague idea for a overarching narrative that all of the other smaller narratives fall under, and you can just leave little clues for how they tie towards that, but you don't have to flesh it all out in the beginning. For instance, this enemy they're hunting down with the artifact, maybe they work for a larger, more sinister organization, thus tying you into a greater plot later on. And now that they've thwarted this enemy, they're on this enemy's list, and they're also after them, and it just brings them into a larger conflict. And another trick I like to recommend to people, this is something I've done many times, no matter how big your world is, it's always great to start your first adventure somewhere small. Like I said, Mortals and Portals is 7 planets, but the first season took place on 1 island. It allowed me more time to flesh out the rest of the lore of the other planets, trickle in the lore as well throughout the story, but not overwhelm everyone and tell a more grounded story, and let the players figure out their characters, and you can start to pick up on things they're interested in, see how the story changes over the arc, and then go from there. All right, that's all I have. Thanks for listening. Like I said, this isn't an exhaustive list. Every GM has their own flair. I just wanted to share some things that I like to think about and that have always helped me. But please like, subscribe, check out the Mortals and Portals podcast, and we will see you next time, Mortals.